Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
In the quiet town of Marowak, nestled in a fog-choked valley, there stood an abandoned train station, Ashcroft Depot. It hadn't seen a passenger in nearly 70 years, but locals swore the platform never stayed empty. Not at night. The story begins with Dean Weller, a freelance photographer who specialized in forgotten places. He was drawn to Ashcroft by local rumors. Trains heard but never seen, passengers waiting for rides that never came, and distant whistles blowing long after midnight. He thought it was perfect, eerie, atmospheric, probably just folklore. But Ashcroft would give him more than just photographs. Dean arrived at dusk, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over rusted tracks and a crumbling ticket booth covered in ivy. His first steps onto the platform were uneventful, save for the sudden drop in temperature. He assumed it was just the elevation. He snapped a few shots of the platform, the decayed benches, the shattered glass of the station clock, which was forever stuck at 1:17. As night settled, a strange silence blanketed the area. Not even insects chirped. Dean set up his tripod to capture some long exposures. That's when he heard it, a faint metallic screech in the distance. It sounded like a train's brakes, but it was far too soft. He strained his ears. There it was again, closer this time, and then a whistle. Low and drawn out. There were no scheduled trains in Marowak. The tracks had been decommissioned in the 1950s after a derailment killed dozens of passengers. The bodies were so badly mangled they had to be buried in a mass grave, and some were never recovered. Dean knew the history. He had read every newspaper clipping he could find. The strange part? No cause for the derailment had ever been confirmed. The conductor, before dying in the wreck, had radioed one last message. There's someone on the tracks, but they're not moving. Dean dismissed the sound as a trick of the wind until he noticed something strange in the viewfinder of his camera. A blur. A shadow standing at the edge of the platform. He looked up. Nothing there. He checked the photo again. The shadow was facing the tracks, its form vaguely human but wrong. Elongated limbs, no discernible face. The longer he stared, the more nauseous he became. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing as if inside a tunnel. But the platform was empty. Dean turned in circles, flashlight trembling in his hand. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all he could hear was the thud of his heart in his ears. Then a whisper, close. You missed the train. Dean spun around. No one. He backed away toward his car, but found his legs wouldn't move. His body felt rooted to the spot, like the concrete itself held him. The station clock above ticked once. Then again. 1:18. The air grew thick with fog, and Dean saw headlights in the distance. A train was approaching, silent, gliding like a ghost on the rusted tracks. It made no sound, no chugging engine, no rumble, just a blinding light that cast long, twisted shadows across the platform. As it drew closer, Dean saw passengers inside, dozens of them, all pale, stiff, unmoving. Their eyes were wide, glassy, staring forward. Some had bloodied clothing. Others looked waterlogged, their skin bloated and blue. And then he saw them blink. The train screeched to a halt. The doors hissed open. A conductor stepped out, dressed in a soot-covered uniform from another era. His face was a mess of burns, skin peeling and blackened. He didn't speak. He simply raised one bony hand and pointed at Dean. Dean felt his body lurch forward against his will. His legs moved, dragging him toward the open door. Inside, the passengers turned their heads slowly to face him, every movement unnatural, stiff like broken marionettes. He screamed, fought against whatever was pulling him. But the cold was too strong. Just as he reached the threshold, the train lights flickered and the fog thickened. Then everything went dark. Dean was never seen again. The only trace left behind was his camera, found the next morning on the platform bench. The last photo was time-stamped 1:17 a.m. It showed the platform, empty. Except for one thing. The train stopped at the edge of the platform with a new passenger stepping on. His mouth was open mid-scream, and behind him dozens of eyes stared out the windows waiting for the next one to join them. To this day, Ashcroft Depot remains untouched. Locals still say they hear the whistle some nights. And if you go there at the right time, when the fog is thick and the air turns to ice, the train will stop for you too. But you'd better board fast. It doesn't like to wait.
Story number 2.
In the early 1980s, a man named Thomas Cole worked as a signalman for a small rural railway station called Millstone Crossing, located in the middle of nowhere in East Texas. It wasn't on any major routes, and only a few freight trains passed through every week. For the most part, it was quiet and isolated, and the job was easy. The pay was decent enough to get by, and Thomas was content. That is, until the nights started to blur. Thomas's shift was from dusk until dawn, which meant long hours alone in the old signal tower overlooking the tracks. The station itself had been built in the early 1900s and had seen better days. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the wind rattled the windows in a way that made the entire building seem alive, like it was breathing. It wasn't long before Thomas started noticing things, small things at first. The flickering of lights that didn't make sense. The sound of footsteps behind him when he was alone. At first, he shrugged it off as the wind or his own nerves. But then came the train. On a cold, foggy evening in November, just past midnight, Thomas was sitting in the signal tower, reading a book to pass the time. That's when he heard it, a distant whistle. He thought it was strange. No train was scheduled to come through that night. But the whistle grew louder, echoing in the thick fog. It was followed by the slow, rhythmic sound of train wheels grinding along the track. Curious, Thomas climbed down from the tower and walked toward the tracks, thinking it was a late freight or something out of schedule. But when he reached the platform, the train still hadn't appeared. The whistle sounded again, much closer this time, but the train was nowhere in sight. He glanced at the track, and there it was, the faint outline of a train's headlights, cutting through the mist. But it wasn't moving. It was still, hanging in the air like a ghost. Thomas stood frozen, unable to look away. Then the train started moving toward him. But as it did, the platform disappeared. The train passed right through the station, the old wooden beams and rusted signs vanishing as the train seemed to glide along tracks that no longer existed. He could hear the sound of metal scraping metal, but nothing was real. The entire world around him had gone completely silent. Suddenly, the whistle blew one last time, sharp, unnervingly loud. A chill ran through Thomas as the train stopped directly in front of him. The doors swung open. Inside the train, there were no passengers, only dark, empty seats, except for one man sitting at the front, staring directly at Thomas. The man's face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were wide but unblinking. Thomas couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The man tilted his head slowly and pointed at him. In that instant, the world seemed to shift. The train was gone, the station was back, the fog lifted, and the night returned to its quiet, empty state. But something was different. Thomas ran back to the signal tower and locked himself inside. He thought he was losing his mind. But from that night on, the whistle returned. Sometimes at the same hour, sometimes earlier, but each time, it was followed by that same empty train. Its headlights cutting through the fog, gliding along the tracks, and stopping at the platform. Always empty. No one else seemed to notice, or perhaps no one dared to talk about it. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. Something was calling him to the train. He couldn't explain why, but the longer he worked there, the more it felt like the station was pulling him in. Weeks passed, and Thomas's behavior began to change. He grew quieter, less attentive. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements sluggish. One night, he simply stopped showing up for his shift. They found his body a week later in the signal tower, slumped in the chair. His face was frozen in a terrified expression, his eyes wide and unblinking, just like the man on the train. When they checked his last reports, they found something strange. At the exact time of his death, the train had passed through Millstone Crossing again. But this time, the train wasn't empty. The passenger cars were full. And every person on board, Thomas included, was staring out the windows, facing the station, waiting. The station is still there today, though it hasn't been used in years. And on certain nights, when the fog rolls in and the moon is full, some people claim they can hear the whistle, faint at first, then growing louder. And if you stand still long enough, you might just see the lights of that train. But don't look too closely, because if you do, you might see yourself sitting on the train too.
Story number 3.
In the summer of 1992, A man named Caleb Harris was traveling across the U.S. by train. He wasn't in a rush, just taking time to explore the country and escape from the busy city life he had grown tired of. He had a habit of getting off at random stops just to see where the tracks would lead him. It was during one of these stops in a small town in Wyoming that he first encountered Hollow Ridge Station. The station was old, so old that it seemed like it had been abandoned long before Caleb even stepped off the train. Its walls were peeling, its windows covered in grime, and a single flickering light hung above the front door. There were no other passengers around, no one in sight. The platform was empty, but Caleb wasn't one to be spooked easily. He pulled his backpack over his shoulder and decided to explore the station. As he walked through the faded wooden doors, he felt a strange sense of heaviness settle over him. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening. No sound of birds, no rustling of trees, just the eerie quiet that seemed to come from nowhere. He tried the door to the waiting room, but it was locked. He checked the timetables on the wall, which were long out of date. Then, as he wandered deeper into the station, he noticed something odd. A single piece of paper was stuck to the back of the ticket counter, barely visible through the grime. It was a schedule of sorts, but it was far too recent to be from the station's opening years. The dates were current, and the train arrivals listed on it didn't match any official routes. Some of them were listed as arriving at times far into the future, and others had no destination at all. Curious, Caleb tucked the paper into his jacket and decided to take a closer look at the station's tracks, wondering if maybe there was an old rail line nearby that had been forgotten. But when he reached the platform, he stopped dead in his tracks. The train tracks seemed to stretch on forever, but something about them was off. The rails were twisted and bent, as if they had been warped over time, almost as though they had been pulled out of shape by some unseen force. That's when he heard it, a distant, familiar sound, the whistle of a train, but there was no train in sight. Caleb turned to look, and he could have sworn the tracks ahead of him were shimmering, like a mirage in the desert. The whistle grew louder, closer, but the train was still nowhere to be seen. He felt a sudden, overwhelming dread crawl up his spine, and before he could stop himself, he started walking toward the sound, pulled by some invisible force. The whistle was deafening now, but still, no train appeared. He was standing at the edge of the platform, staring down the track, when the ground beneath his feet suddenly trembled. Then the train appeared. It wasn't like any train he had ever seen before. Its headlights were so bright, they cut through the air like daggers. The body of the train was impossibly long, covered in rust and decay. The windows were all blacked out, but Caleb felt eyes watching him, peering through the glass. It was as if the train was full of people, but there was no one to see. The doors slid open. Without thinking, Caleb stepped forward. The train was completely still, the air around it dense, heavy, and suffocating. He didn't know why he stepped onto the train. It felt as if he had no choice in the matter, like it was inevitable. The second he stepped inside, the doors slammed shut behind him. The train jerked forward, the screech of the wheels against the track sending a shiver down his spine. The interior was dark and oppressive. The walls were lined with faded, torn fabric, and the seats were empty. But there was something strange about them. They didn't look like seats people would sit in, but more like beds. Thin sheets were spread across them, stained and yellowed with age. And then came the voices. They were soft at first, barely audible, whispering from the shadows. But as Caleb moved deeper into the train, they grew louder. Hushed conversations, eerie laughter, and the low hum of murmured prayers. The voices sounded familiar, too familiar. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the voices he was hearing were his own thoughts, his own fears being spoken back to him. He heard fragments of conversations he had had with his friends, his family, his ex-girlfriends, all of it repeating like a broken record. Suddenly, one voice broke through, clearer than the rest. "You're not supposed to be here." Caleb froze. It was his own voice. He spun around, but there was no one. The train was empty, yet he could hear himself speaking, his own words echoing in his mind. "You shouldn't have boarded. You shouldn't have come." His breath quickened. The train didn't stop. It didn't slow. It just kept moving through the dark, empty landscape, until there was nothing left. No stars in the sky, no moon, just an endless black void. And then he saw it. At the very end of the train, a figure appeared, someone standing in the last car. The figure was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, and had a face obscured by shadows. But Caleb could feel its eyes on him, piercing into his soul. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the door. "You belong here now," the voice echoed. "You're one of us now." The train didn't stop until it reached the end of the line, an empty, forgotten station that wasn't marked on any map. They say that Caleb's body was never found. But every now and then, if you're near the tracks at Hollow Ridge Station, you can hear the faint sound of a whistle. And sometimes, just when the wind picks up, you might see the shadow of a train pulling into the station. If you're unlucky enough to catch a glimpse, you might even see a figure in one of the windows, staring out at the dark, empty platform. And they say that if you listen closely, you'll hear one last whisper. You shouldn't have come. No one ever leaves that train. And if you get too close, you might find yourself on board.
Story number 4.
In 2013, a woman named Lila McCarthy was working as a freelance journalist in Chicago. She had always loved the idea of taking spontaneous trips and writing about her experiences. One weekend, she decided to take a short trip out of the city with no particular destination in mind. She boarded a train bound for a small town upstate, known for its charming antique shops and quiet countryside. Lila had a special fondness for train rides. There was something peaceful about the rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the tracks, and the way the world outside seemed to blur and melt into something out of a dream. But this train ride was different from the start. When she boarded, the train was nearly empty, except for a few tired-looking passengers scattered across the cars. She found a seat by the window and settled in, watching the city skyline disappear in the distance. The strange thing was, as the train moved farther out into the countryside, it started to feel wrong. At first, it was subtle, nothing major. The train seemed a little too quiet, a little too still. The air felt heavier, thicker, like something was pressing down on the carriages. Lila dismissed it as fatigue from a long week of work, but as time passed, the discomfort grew. The windows began to fog up, despite the air conditioning running, and the overhead lights flickered occasionally. After about 2 hours, the train made a stop at a station Lila didn't recognize. It wasn't on the route map she had seen when she boarded, and there was no mention of this stop over the intercom. In fact, the conductor didn't even announce the station name. The station itself was oddly quiet. No one waiting on the platform, no sign of life whatsoever. Just an empty building, its exterior coated in grime and rust. The platform looked abandoned, and the station had the eerie vibe of a place that had been untouched by time, like something out of a forgotten era. The train paused for what felt like too long, and a strange chill seemed to settle over the car. Lila felt a sudden urge to get off, to leave, to take the next train back to the city. But the doors didn't open. The train remained still, locked in place, as though waiting for something. Then, as if on cue, the lights in the car flickered one final time, and the entire train began to lurch forward again. The brakes squealed, and the sound of the wheels on the tracks intensified, almost to the point of deafening. Lila tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, but couldn't. She glanced out the window, only to see that the landscape around her had changed. Where once there were fields and farmland, now the ground was covered with dense fog. The fog wasn't natural, though. It swirled unnaturally, moving like smoke, and soon it obscured the view entirely. She could no longer see the station behind her. And then, for the first time during the entire journey, she heard a voice, a soft, hoarse whisper, coming from the seat across from her. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks. But when she looked up, she saw a figure sitting there, a man, hunched forward, his face obscured by shadows. He was wearing a tattered overcoat, and his hands were clasped tightly in front of him. Lila froze, but the man didn't move. He didn't even look at her. There was something unsettlingly still about him, like a mannequin. The more she stared, the more she could feel her heart pounding. She couldn't look away. The fog outside the window grew thicker, and a strange ringing began to echo in her ears, like a low hum she couldn't escape. The man's voice came again, soft, barely audible, whispering words she couldn't understand. Then, in a cold, clear voice, he said one thing that sent a chill down her spine. "You should have stayed off this train." In a panic, Lila jumped from her seat, but the train had no more visible exits. The doors wouldn't budge. She pounded on the window, shouting for help, but no one seemed to hear her. She turned back to the man, but he was gone. In his place, there was a faded yellow ticket stub on the seat where he had sat. The number on the ticket wasn't any she recognized, but the time listed on it matched the exact moment she'd been aboard the train. Frantically, she tore her eyes away from the ticket and looked around the car again, but the passengers had changed. The car was no longer empty. There were people in every seat now, faces turned toward her, their eyes vacant and glazed. They weren't staring at her in anger or hatred, just in silence, as though they were trapped, just like her. And then it clicked. The train wasn't taking her to the town she had planned to visit. It wasn't taking her anywhere she recognized. It wasn't even on the route map anymore. Lila stood frozen in horror as the train continued to move, faster now with no destination in sight, through a never-ending sea of fog. When the train finally came to a stop, it wasn't at a station. It was just an endless stretch of tracks surrounded by darkness. The doors opened automatically. The fog rolled in, thick as smoke, and the same quiet, empty platform from before stretched before her, waiting. Lila never made it to her destination that day. No one ever saw her again. And when people ask about the train, no one can give a straight answer. There's no record of it. No one knows where it came from or where it was headed. But every once in a while, on foggy nights, that some people claim they can hear the soft clink-clink of distant train wheels rolling through the mist, just out of sight. And if you happen to be standing at the platform, you might just hear a whisper. You shouldn't have boarded, because sometimes the train you get on isn't one you can ever get off.